Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I've hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. Each month, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self-identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our program, please send us your questions and let us know where you are watching from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Nat Shaffir share his firsthand account of the Holocaust with us. Nat, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person today.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be here and share with you a little bit of my personal experience as to what happened to me and my family during the Holocaust.
Nat, you have so much to share with us. We'll just go ahead and get started right away in our brief hour together. Nat, you were born in Romania in December 1936, less than 3 years before the start of World War II. Will you begin by telling us about your family and your community in the years leading up to the start of the war?
Both my parents were born in small villages in the eastern part of Hungary. My mother was the oldest of 12 children, and my father was the youngest of 7. My mother's mother died at childbirth with her 10th child, and my mother, being 13 years old and the first oldest girl, was able actually to take care of her 9 siblings. And a few years later, her father remarried and 2 children were born. The new wife, not only didn't she want to take care of somebody else's 10 children, but she insisted that my mother take care of her 2 children, which she did. In 1924, my father and 2 of his brothers decided to leave home and immigrated to Romania, where they settled in a village called Bucium, where they established a dairy farm. Before long, they became very successful because my father was able to secure the Romanian army as their prime customer for their dairy products. A few years later, my father decided it's time for him to get married. The most logical place to find a bride in those days was for someone to go back to the village one came from, where people knew him and he knew them. So that's what he did. In 1930, he went back to Hungary, found a girl. A week later, he was married, stayed in the village for another week or so, and then they boarded a train for Romania. It's important to know that it was my mother's first time on a train and first time outside of her village. My mother was only 16 when she got married to my father.
Just think about the rapidity of that change. 1 week they meet, they marry. She makes her first trip ever out of the village on a train and moves to another country. That's pretty amazing.
The reason they stayed in the village, by the way, for another week, because according to Jewish religion, you have these 7 days of prayers, of goodwill prayers. So that's where they stayed for another week. So they arrived at the farm. They settled in the house that my father built. And before long, 3 children were born, 2 girls and a boy, and I'm that boy.
Tell us about your sisters, if you don't mind.
I had 2 sisters. My older sister her name was Sarah, and my younger sister, which I used to call my little sister, her name was Lily. She was about 2 years younger than me.
And I think we have a photograph of your sisters here.
Yeah, that's one. So we see in here to the right is my mother, which is the woman a little shorter than the one on the left. To her right, which was the other woman, is my mother's next sister, which was 1 year younger than her. Below her is my older sister, Sarah. And to her side, one circled, is myself, but maybe a year and a half, almost less than 2 years old.
Yeah.
And this looks like on a kind of fall day sometimes, maybe. And her name was Hannah. My mother's sister was Hannah. she probably came from a vacation or came just to visit, and that's why she was taken.
And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about Hannah later in the program. Tell us some about your family's dairy farm. What was that like?
Uh, for 18 years that my father lived on that farm, he lived in peace and harmony with the Gentile farmers in the area. He traded with them. He helped them whenever they needed help. So everything was good in the farm. As a 4-year-old growing up on that farm, I was given daily chores to take care of, collecting the eggs from the chicken coop or feeding the small animals. It was a primitive life, but it was a great life. Personally, I loved nature. I loved the open fields, the animals. So things was okay. I had both. Went to kindergarten. I went to first grade. I had both Jewish and non-Jewish friends. One of our neighbors, was the priest of the town. That priest used to come by our house and ask my father for a donation to the church every week, and also for some dairy products for some of his congregants who could not otherwise afford it. In those 18 years, my father never once refused such a request until things changed.
Yeah. Do you personally remember living the farm life? Do you remember that?
Yes, not only do I remember also seeing the priest coming by, because every time he came, there was open field we lived on, and my mother always used to send us out to go out and greet the priest and ask him about his health, ask him about his family. So we always kind of did that almost every time that the priest came out.
Tell us what you can about what kind of community Buchum itself was.
Luchum was a small farm community. The total population, I don't remember, but I know there was about 75% Gentile and 25% Jewish. Almost the entire Jewish community was Orthodox. We had our synagogue, we had our services, so everything was normal life, the same life that these people had prior to coming to Buchum, where they came from Hungary.
And anything more you can share with us about sort of what family life was like for you?
It was a quiet life. We lived, in our own house. My father's brothers lived a little bit further up on the hill on the same farm, because it was kind of spread out. There were 3 houses. One was our house, one was my father's oldest brother's house, and one was my father's middle brother's house. They had children as well, so we kind of used to see him from time to time. But what I mostly liked being on the farm was to hang out with the farm help. They taught me how to milk a cow and ride a horse at age 5. So I was always kind of part of that group.
Mm-hmm. And this photo was actually taken later after the war, but this is your family with you, your mom and dad, and your 2 sisters.
That's correct. And you can see my father, with a little beard that he had. So that showed some of his religiosity. Myself with a different kind of an outfit you don't see today anymore, but that's was.
Nat, in 1940, a new Romanian dictatorship introduced anti-Semitic policies restricting Jewish life in Romania. The country aligned itself with Nazi Germany, joining the Axis powers in November 1940. Will you tell us how this impacted Jewish life at that time?
We heard many things going on in different parts of Romania and Hungary, but we really didn't know exactly to what effect it actually happened against Jewish people. But little by little, things filter in to the Buchum area, that Jews are being killed, Jews are being sent away, very bad pogroms are happening. So there was a lot of problems going on between the Christian, or between the Gentile and the Jewish people. So the Jewish people were pretty much afraid what was going on. Us, ourselves, in Buchum did not feel that anti-Semitism that much as it was felt in the big city of Iași, for 2 reasons. Number one, because we kind of small community, nobody really bothered us. And second, because my father dealt with the army, so they kind of pretty much protected us in a way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you mentioned, Nat, of course, that you were getting word, you were hearing there were pogroms going on elsewhere. In July 1941, Romanian authorities staged a pogrom violent mob attacks against the Jewish population in the nearby city of Iași. Can you tell us about this particular pogrom?
There were two pogroms. One is this one, which is just shown here, that people were rounded up on the street, and for no reason whatsoever, they were beaten up. Some of them, the police did not like what they looked like or did not like what they're wearing. They took them down on the street and shot them and let them stay there for a few days. So as you can see in here, these people, the Jews, are rounded up next to a store. If you take a look at the upper right-hand corner of that store, it says Steinberg, which must have been was a Jewish store. And the policeman is one policeman and two soldiers with arms kind of watching them. Some of these people probably later on were dragged to the middle of the street and shot. That's why most of the people in 1940 never went outside because they were afraid they would be rounded up and killed. Also, a lot of the neighbors, some of the neighbors, were killing Jewish people literally with shovels, axes, pipes, anything they can get a hold of, strictly for one reason: to take away their property.
Mm-hmm. Nat, you mentioned a second pogrom.
Yeah, this happened in July of 1941, where 3 trainloads of Jews were loaded in Iași and were ferried in the height of the heat in July south to Kalarashi for 3 days. And after 3 days, these 3 trainloads came back to Iași, where half of the Jews in these cars were dead because they didn't have any food or water. So after 3 days, they were dead. So in the end of June and the beginning of July, 10,000 Jews were murdered, by some of them by the authorities and some of them strictly by their neighbors.
And these particular 2 horrible pogroms that you just mentioned, how soon do you know that your family heard about these?
We pretty much heard it right away because some of the hired help were going to Iași to bring in supplies to the farm. So we were told about these pogroms going on. Mm-hmm. There was other small ones, small beatings and small killings, but this were major pogroms.
Nat, before we go on, I'd like to let you know that you are being listened to and watched from people not only around the United States, but across the globe, as a matter of fact. I'd like to welcome our viewers who are watching from all over the place. We have viewers in Washington, D.C., Florida, North Carolina, Iowa, and Texas. And welcome to our international viewers today in France, Malta, Denmark, Argentina, and Germany. And I'd like to share with you, Nat, a comment from a viewer named Rosa. Rosa writes, "Greetings from Malta. I really appreciate these conversations. Thank you, Mr. Shaffir, for sharing your experiences."
Thank you, Rosa.
And I'd also like to remind our audience that if they have questions for you, and we hope that they do, that they please send them via the chat. Nat, in the fall of 1942, Jewish families from Buchum were abruptly forced from their homes and told to move to the Sokola neighborhood in Iași. Tell us what happened to you and your family.
One day in November of 1942, the same priest that used to come by the house every week, this time he came with police officers and 2 armed soldiers.
The same one that came and asked your dad for his help all those times.
That's correct.
Okay.
So since this never happened before, we all came out from the house and found out what was going on. When we came close to the group, the priest turned to the police officers and, pointing at us, he said to the police officers, "Est des Gitans, these are Jews." So we were turned into the authority because we were Jews by the priest, the same priest who asked and received help from my father every week for 18 years. But then the police officer told us that we have 4 hours to vacate the farm because we are being relocated. Both my parents tried to reason with him, tried to beg him to let us stay, but obviously it cannot happen. So the first thing we did, we went back into the house to start to pack. Now you look around, whatever you have in the house that you used, what do you take? You have 4 hours, what do you take? So my father, being kind of important figure, and he knew exactly what needs to be done and under circumstances, he said, the first thing we need to take all the valuables that we can trade later on with. And then we take some necessities that we know what we're going to need. Now, at this point, we pretty much knew where we were going because a ghetto was established in 1941, about a year earlier. So the first thing we did, we took all the cash we had in the house. We took my mother's jewelry, 2 candlesticks that my mother was lighting candles every Friday night. Then we start taking clothing, cooking and baking utensils, bedding, blankets, and things like that. So once the 4 hours were over, we were taken to the Sokola ghetto and turned over to the ghetto authorities.
Before
That
you go
day,
on, Nat, some of the things that I think we're seeing examples of what the few things that you were able to take with you. Tell us about this.
this is a pair of candlesticks that my mother lit candles every Friday night. And that has been handed over from mother to daughter, from mother to daughter for about a few generations. My mother was the 5th generation to receive these candlesticks. These candlesticks were made in 1745. And my mother, usually the mother would give it to their older daughter. My mother kind of broke that system, and she gave it, instead of to her older daughter, she gave it to my wife, which was her daughter-in-law. And my wife also broke the mold and gave it to my younger daughter, which she still has him at this point, and she lights candles in them every Friday night.
And I think we have another picture of something else that your family was able to take.
We took some Bibles and we took some prayer books. This is a book called the Haggadah Shel Pesach. This is a book that we use for Passover. So one of the things we took that. We took some of Megillah, which was for Purim. So we tried to figure out, continue our Jewish heritage. So we took those with us.
So you were given 4 hours after 18 years of your parents having this farm to gather everything, or your father having the farm, gather everything. How did you carry the things, and what was your journey to Sokola like? Do you remember that?
Very, very easily. First of all, was many Jews were rounded up that day, and the surrounding towns and villages of Iași and brought into that ghetto. Once we arrived in the ghetto, we were turned over to the ghetto authorities. But were told we were, number one, they were taking down our names, gender, and ages. We were given a yellow star that we had to wear on our left breast pocket at all times. We were given ration cards for bread and kerosene. Religion was against the law at this point. Jewish children could no longer go to school. As living quarters, we received one room in a house that already housed 4 other families. Total people that lived in these 5 rooms under one roof was 28. So needless to say, it was very, very crowded. In addition to that, every individual between the ages of 18 and 50 was assigned a manual job to do whatever the government needed to do. My mother's job was to be an orderly at the hospital, where she had to scrub toilets and scrub floors. My father's job was to sweep the streets, or some of the streets that he was assigned to in Iași. And then later on, he was cleaning the market area, which was every Thursday was the market area for Iași.
Mm-hmm. Now we have a question from a viewer named Debbie. Debbie asks, as a 5-year-old, what was your understanding of what was happening?
As a 5-year-old, probably most what I can remember was the hate that people showed against Jewish people, especially figuring out children and women and so on. So that was the most thing I remember, was the hate that was showed up.
Do you know, Nat, when you were forced to leave Buchum and go to Sokola, do you think your parents thought this was a temporary event and that they would be able to return to the farm at some point?
Originally, probably there was the idea that would happen only temporarily. But once we arrived there, we pretty much heard what was going on in other parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, and we knew that we're here for the long haul.
Tell us a bit more about sort of daily life living in Sokola? Particularly, how did your parents manage to get the basic necessities of just staying alive and like food and clothing and heat, things like that?
As I mentioned earlier, we received ration cards for bread and kerosene. The ration cards for bread consisted of a quarter of a loaf of bread per person every 2 days and 5 liters of kerosene once a week per family. Just to give you an idea what a quarter of a loaf of bread is, approximately 6 slices, about the 3/4 of an inch thick, that would have to last us for 2 days. So to receive these rations, we had to go outside of the ghetto and line up at the bakery or the kerosene station. My father told my older sister to go and get the bread rations because the bakery was not that far away from where we lived. And the kerosene station was pretty far away and also was very heavy to carry in the way back. So I got that job. So my father sent my older sister to get the bread rations until one day he found out there were some hooligans picking on Jewish girls, and he was afraid something will happen to my sister. So from that day on, he sent me to get the bread rations.
Yeah.
Now it's important to know that the same hooligans not only picked on Jewish girls, but they also picked on Jewish boys. Many times I would come home all beaten up with a bloody face, but that never hurt me as much as when these hooligans also stole my bread, which meant for the next 2 days we had nothing to eat. When my mother noticed the first time the thing happened, she also noticed that this could happen again. And from that date on, she started rationing us from our own rations. In other words, the first time I got my rations of bread, she removed one slice. 2 days later, she removed another slice, and we ate the old slice we ate until she accumulated an entire loaf of bread this way. So we had one reserve. And then these hooligans again stole my bread. At least we had something reserved and something to eat.
But just to focus on that for a minute, in order to have something to eat, if you were to have your bread stolen, the little meager bread that you had, she had to reduce the amount you could eat in order to store away that one extra loaf just in case.
That's correct. And this way, we never had fresh bread. We always ate 1 day or 2-year-old bread.
Yeah, yeah. Nat, your father helped so many people in the community for so long through his previous work with his farm. Did your parents receive any help from anyone they knew?
As I also mentioned earlier, that part of my father's job that he was assigned to was to sweep the streets of Iași, and also to clean the market area on Thursdays, because Thursday was the market for Iași. One Thursday, when he was cleaning the area, an old farmer who my father helped many, many times, and he knew my father very well, approached him and said, "I'm so sorry to see you under these circumstances. You and your brothers were good people. You helped so many of us. And here you are having to pick up the manure from my horse and from oxens. Really breaks my heart to see you that way. Is there anything I can do for you to help?" And my father told him right away, he says, "Yes, some extra food would help us a lot." So he said, "I'm going to see what I can do." The next week, when he came back to the market, he told my father that a few of the farmers that my father helped in the past realized what a great help he was for them during these years. They decided it's willing for them to help. Keep in mind that it was against the law to help Jewish people. And anybody caught helping Jewish people could easily be arrested. So this farmer said to my father that we're going to try and help you, and here's how we're going to do it so we cannot be arrested. He said, all the farmers get together in a large field, and as a caravan, they move on Wednesday night all together to the market area to arrive there Thursday morning. That caravan passes the outskirts of the city of the ghetto between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. He says in the north part of the ghetto, about 1 kilometer outside the ghetto, there's a little church with some trees around it. Be there and look out for between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. By the way, being outside between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning only meant one thing, that the individual is trying to flee, which was be punished by imprisoned or probably shot as well. So my father did decide to take that chance, and he went out to meet these farmers to see what was going on and see what can help. So my father was waiting for this caravan to come forward. And then when he saw the caravan, then he was looking out for the last three wagons because that farmer told him that's what they're going to be. So he waited, and then before long, these last three wagons stopped in front of that church, and they dropped a sack of stuff next to the road. My father waited until they all left, waited some more to make sure that there's no police to look what happened. And then he went out, picked up that sack, and went back to the ghetto. That morning, when we found out what had happened during the night, my mother was very upset at my father for risking his life. But then, when he opened that sack and he took out some eggs and some cheese and some apples, and my mother saw the smile of our faces, she realized, she mellowed, and she realized that what he was doing, he's doing for the family. And she let him go out every Thursday after that to bring back some things. And every Thursday we found various other things in the sack. Also, it's important to remember that each ghetto had a black market, and so did ours. So sometimes my father would take me with some of the items that we received from these farmers to the black market area to trade eggs for potatoes, potatoes for apples, whatever we needed. And then he always took me with him, not only for his protection, but also to carry this contraband, because a grown up carrying contraband with anything else besides the bread that we carried from the bakery was contraband. So if a grown up carried this contraband, he would be arrested. A child would be slapped around by the police a couple of times and let go. So I always went with my father trading on the black market. That really taught me a lot of experience.
That's remarkable what you've just described to us. Both the farmers and your father taking immense risks. It had to be for your father. It had to be extraordinarily, not only stressful, but frightening. And then to do that over and over again, remarkable. Now we have, while living in the Sokola ghetto, you and your family face many restrictions, of course. We have a video question from a student, Sanaya, related to these circumstances. So let's go ahead and hear from Sanaya.
Hi, my name is Sanaya. I'm from Laurel, Maryland. And what did you do when you weren't allowed to go to public school anymore?
Sanaya asks, what did you do when you weren't allowed to go to public school anymore?
Thank you, Sanaya, for that question. Education was very, very important to my mother, that we got educated. And obviously, when she realized we can no longer go to school, she had to figure out something else, what could be done. Because my father, after coming back from a hard days of labor in the ghetto, and my mother the same thing, was very hard to teach. But there's one old rabbi and his wife that were in the ghetto as well. She tried to convince him how important it is for him to continue education to other children. So he agreed to tutor us. He taught us religious subjects, and his wife taught us secular subjects, like math and reading and so on. For that, my mother always used to take something that we received from these farmers. She said, Nat, take this to the old rabbi. Either it was a piece of bread or some cornbread or a couple of potatoes. So because the money, he couldn't do anything with that because he couldn't go out and buy anything.
Right.
Because it was the law for the Jew to go into a store, even though they could go outside the ghetto, but they couldn't buy anything. So that's what helped them a lot. And that's what helped us a lot.
Now, there were so many restrictions on you. You couldn't go to school. You couldn't leave the ghetto. So many things you couldn't do. Were you allowed to practice your religion in any way? And did your family find a way to practice their religion?
Well, practicing religion was against the law right away. So you could not gather in any way few different Jews. So for us, in particular, religious Jews, you need 10 people to be able to pray as a group. But nonetheless, people had was very important to them to continue their religion. So they would be gathering from time to time in different rooms somewhere and continue their prayers. So we did that, but we did that in private.
Nat, I know you as an adult as a really adventurous and vigorous, always in motion. There you were, a little boy in those circumstances. What was life like for you as a boy?
It was pretty tough. It was very, very hard. we couldn't go anywhere, we couldn't do anything. But then, we couldn't do anything because we were starving to death almost every day. We were hungry every day. But that really did not stop us in a way, because we tried to do whatever we were able to do. Number one, go visit my cousins that were a little bit part of the other part of the ghetto, the ones that my father's older brothers, sisters, and older brothers, and the youngest brother. So we were doing that. But then after a while, I had to pretty much take care of the family myself.
Yeah. And Nat, you've mentioned that you had ration cards for kerosene. Tell us about the importance of kerosene fuel at the time and about your experience with Grigori.
To receive the kerosene rations, again, we had to walk outside the ghetto to line up at the kerosene stations. Now, to give an idea of what it looks like, it's like if a kerosene station is like a little country type gas station. So there was a little booth and a little box in the front of the booth, which carried in front of the box was a cylinder. In the front of that cylinder was a handle. And every time you move that handle right to left, that would bring up some kerosene into that cylinder. Once the cylinder was full, that would be the 5 liters. So one day I was trying to figure out how can I get a little bit extra kerosene and see, especially after my father risked his life going out for us. I said, what can I do to help the family? So I came to the point that I had an idea. And once I got to the point where I had to get my rations for that week, I asked the attendant, his name was Grigori. I'll never forget his name or his face. So I said to him, Domnul Grigori, I'd like to help you. And I used the word Domnul, which is a title for somebody very important, very educated, with a lot of power. Grigori, on the other hand, was uneducated, lazy, and a drunk. He didn't like to work. He didn't like to do anything. So I told him, Domnul Grigori, I'd like to help you. And then he said to me, how are you going to do that, little Zhidan? He called me little Zhidan, little Jew, because I was not that tall kid. So I said, looks like you're sick. Why don't you let me help you do your job? And if that pleases you, please give me an extra bit of kerosene because I can use it. I have a little sister at home. She is sick. And a little bit extra warmth in the house would help us a lot. He didn't say anything. I got my rations and went back home. The next week, I lined up again like I always do. But instead of Mr. Domnul Grigori going into his booth to warm up, he kept moving along the line that everybody was lined up. And when he made eye contact with me, he motioned to me to come forward. And when I came forward, he said to me, okay, little Zhidan, let me see what we can do. It was not a big deal to pump a little kerosene, even for a 7-year-old. So I did that, and I was hoping he's going to give me something in return. He didn't. The next week, he said, you don't have to wait in line anymore. You're doing a good job. Come and wait for me at the pump, which I did. And again, I finished the day's work. He didn't give me anything in return. It took about 4 weeks until he said to me, little Zhidan, next time you come, bring an extra can. And from that point on, he gave me an extra liter. And depends how drunk he was. Sometimes he'll forget he already gave me. He gave me another liter. I should never say anything. So it was a good relationship. He and I had a good relationship. One day I remember looking for a shirt because all the stuff that we had brought with us, we stored underneath the beds. So when I looked for a clean shirt, I found a bottle of Slivovitz. For those who don't know what Slivovitz is, it's a plain brandy. Mm-hmm. So I found a bottle of Slivovitz. I decided to take that to Domnul Grigori. So I came to the station and I said to him, Domnul Grigori, I have a present for you. I opened up, I wrapped it in a shirt. I opened it up and I showed him the Slivovitz and his eyes lit up. So he must have been a very good bottle of Slivovitz. So he said to me, I presume he wants some extra kerosene for that. And I said, actually, no. What I would like is that you could do that. Give me another ration card for a family of 4, where this boy wants to have another ration card. I can get another 5 liters of kerosene, another loaf of bread. Took about 3 weeks. He came back and he gave me a ration card for another family of 4, which later on helped me a lot, trading for other things.
I have to remind myself that on top of all that you've just described, you're a little boy and you're carrying this kerosene each week, and doubling the load at some point. Remarkable. Let me ask you this, Nat. You were just about 7 years old at this time. Can you reflect on what you think gave you the courage to even think of this and then to go and approach this man and make your proposition to him?
Well, there was, first of all, I figured I remember what my father did for us. So I said, as I mentioned, what can I do for the family and what can I do to pay my father back and also to make him proud, because my father and I had a great relationship. And I always looked up for my father and I wanted to kind of emulate him, what he was doing, so I can do the same thing. So this was one of the things that I thought maybe I can do and maybe be able to be successful at that. The other way, I never thought of not being successful. So I always thought positive. So I didn't think it's going to fail, but then it could have.
Hmm. Before we go on, Nat, I'd like to remind our audience to please share their questions with you via the chat feature. So please keep those questions coming. Nat, life continued in this way for you for about 7 months until June 1943, when your family was no longer able to remain together. Tell us what happened to cause your family to no longer be together. What happened to your father?
In June of 1943, my father was ordered to be deported to a forced labor camp. And the day he was supposed to go to the meeting area where he was supposed to report, I asked him if I can walk with him. We were walking. He said to me, Nat, things get worse before they get better. Never give up. And he repeated that, never give up. And I remember that for many, many years afterwards. Also, as we continued walking, finally stopped and he said, Nat, it's time for you to go back to the ghetto, to the house. Then he turned to me, he put both his hands on my shoulder, and he said 5 words to me I will remember these 5 words for the rest of my life. He said, Nat, take care of the girls. As I mentioned, I was not yet 7 years old. You can't imagine the weight of these 5 words that I had to carry on my shoulder at all times.
Now, we just had a question just pop up from one of our viewers. Victoria in Tennessee asks, what were your emotions? You just started to talk a little bit about what were your emotions when your father told you, take care of the girls?
I could have said 2 things. I could have said, I will try, I'll do my best. But again, being a positive individual, I said, I will take care of the girls, Papa, I will. So the emotion was that, okay, my father's not going to be here, but it's my turn to take care of the family. And that's what kept me really moving forward, because not only was it for me, but I figured if I don't survive and if I give up, my mother and my 2 sisters would not survive either.
When your father was deported, did you know what work he ended up doing? Were you able to find that out?
We didn't know what he was doing, but we heard that they were deported on the border of Moldova and Ukraine to lay railroad tracks, as you can see in here. And it was very, very hard work. If you take a look on the right-hand side, you see an individual with a white shirt with a hammer. So the big boulders were brought to a certain area, and people with sledgehammers were breaking up these big boulders into rocks and then put them across the area. And then on that, you put ties, and on top of the ties, you put the railroad tracks. Here we see individual soldiers looking around to make sure we are all working. Also, we see 2 horses and a buggy, where we see a officer, looks like they came to inspect how the progress is going. So this is very, very hard work, working 14, 16, sometimes 18-hour day for very, very little food. Later on, we found out that many of these people died in this camp because of so hard work and so little food.
From your description, Nat, you have really showed us how much is actually going on in that photo. And you think of the crushed rock that makes up a railroad bed and the fact that these forced laborers like your father were forced to break up boulders into tiny little bits of rock to form that track bed. That's extraordinary. And of course, at least in this photo, they're completely exposed to the elements here. Yeah. Nat, while your father was away, did your mother hear from him?
We never heard from my father the entire period of time that he was away. I remember my mother almost every night crying and praying to make sure that my father returns healthy and alive. So that's how I used to go to sleep almost every night, hearing my mother's crying voice.
Which meant probably that you weren't even certain that he was alive.
We never knew that, and we never knew if we ever going to see my father again.
Right. With your father gone and the farmers no longer able to provide extra food, as your father could no longer obviously go out and get the food, how did you, your sisters, and your mother continue to manage, make ends meet, feed yourselves?
Well, first, number one, from the rations that we received for our own. Then we had the extra rations that Dominic Grigori gave me a ration card. So we had an extra loaf of bread and some more kerosene. So I would take that part of the bread, maybe a quarter of a loaf of bread, maybe sometimes a half a bread, and try to trade that myself for potatoes and something that we actually could have used a little bit more. So at this point, we were able to have some variety. Now, I used to go with my father to the area that we were trading on the black market. I remember one time we had some eggs that we got from the farmer, and my mother said to him, "Why don't you guys go out and get some potatoes?" Because we hadn't had any potato soup in a long time. So my father and I went out, took 3 out of the 6 eggs that we received from the farmers that day, and to trade for some potatoes. So we reached the area, and the first person that we saw, the first question is asked, "What do you have and what do you want or what do you need?" So my father said, "We have 3 eggs and we want to trade for potatoes." So the individual said, "I'll give you 5 potatoes for these 3 eggs." And my father said, let me think about it. We continued a little bit further. We saw another individuals and the same questions, "What do you have and what do you need?" So my father said, "I want to trade 3 eggs for some potatoes." So that individual said, "I'll give you 4 potatoes for these 3 eggs." And my father said, "Okay." Then he walked away and I said, "Papa, the first one was going to give us 5 potatoes. Why did you take 4? He says, "That's true. Today we would have gotten an extra potato, but that individual is not a very honest person. So in the long run, he probably would have cheated us. So always remember, deal honestly and deal with honest people." And that carried me through my life a long, long time.
Nat, the war ended for you when the Soviet army took control of Iași in the summer of 1944. What was it like for you, your mother, and your sisters in that time leading up to your liberation?
The city was bombed almost every night, begin in the middle of July to the beginning of August, and then increased very heavily every day between the middle of August to the end of August. And the end of August, we were liberated by the Russians. Once we were liberated, we never heard from my father all these 14 months that he was not there. We had a little bit more freedom. We had some more food, but life in Iași, in the ghetto in particular, was pretty much the same. We now lived under a communist rule, which was very anti-Semitic. Yeah. We were able to go back to school, but we were ridiculed by individuals because we were Jews. Because the law in Romania is that if you don't pass a test from 1 year to the next, you remain in that class. So since we were no longer able to go to school, we missed all these 2 years of learning or 2 years of schooling. So many of us were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old in first grade and second grade. So the Gentile children were making fun of us, saying, "These Jewish children must be dumb because look at him, he's 8 years old in his first grade." Anyway, we caught up after that.
Now, let me take you back for a moment to the time of your liberation. You said that you were bombs were dropped, you were under bombardment. How were you able to find refuge while, literally bombs are dropping around you? And what would you do to be safe, if anything?
Well, our ghetto was open ghetto. As we know from history, there were closed ghettos and open ghettos. Our ghetto was open ghetto, which meant outside of the ghetto or fields. So whenever these bombs were dropping, we all ran out to the fields. And when the men were still around, especially the older men and the below 18, would dig in trenches, and we would run out and stay in the trenches. So the those people who were bombing the city were not interested in bombing open fields. They were interested in bombing houses.
Mhm.
So we always run out to the open fields and stay in the trenches until, as I mentioned, towards the ends of August, for 3 days in a row, day and night, it would bomb. So we were there without food or any water. Luckily, there's young individuals would run out and try to figure out how to bring back into these trenches some food and some water, and that kind of helped us a lot.
I can only imagine how terrifying that had to be for your mother, uh, uh, seeking shelter in the open, literally in trenches with 3 children with her. Yep. Nat, before the Soviets really exercised control over the country, at what point did you think that you and your mother at least felt we're safe? We're safe. We've lived. We're safe. Was there a time when you had that feeling?
Right away, we felt safe because, number one, we had more food. The Russian soldiers really embraced us, or we embraced the Russian soldiers because they liberated us. So there was a good feeling between the Russian soldiers and the community,
Mm.
especially if we got more food. So we thought we were pretty safe at this point.
And how about your dad? When did your father return to forced labor? Do you remember that? What was that like?
We reunited my father sometimes in the spring of 1945 when he was liberated also by the Russians. And the day he came back, we stayed with us in the ghetto still for about a week. And then he said to me, Nat, let's go back and get the farm in order to bring the family back, which we did. We started off working to the farm. And then he said to me, you know what? Let's stop at that old farmer who helped us all these weeks with that extra food and thank him properly. So we stopped at the old farmer and we wanted to thank him, and he was very happy to see us. He invited us for a meal. And after the meal, he asked us where we were going. And my father said, we're going back to the farm. So he gave us the bad news at this point. He said, that farm no longer belongs to you. It was confiscated and was divided into 3 sections. One of the sections was given to the priest and his family as a thank you because he turned in all the Jews from the Buchum area to the authorities. But the farmer also said, it's very bad for you to go back. You risk your life to go back to the farm. My father took his advice and we never went back to the farm. So we came back, and obviously we never went back to the farm.
We have a question from Casey. Casey asks, what became of that priest? And start there, and then I have another comment to share with you. What happened to the priest then?
At this point, we don't know what happened to the priest because once the communist regime came in, they became part of the communist regime as well. So he and his family kept running that farm, but we never saw him again. We never did want to see him again. So at this point, we don't know what happened.
And we have a comment and a question from Brianna. Brianna says, thank you for speaking about your experiences. We will not let the world forget. And then she asks, how do you move past the betrayal that you just described, or did you?
First of all, let's say it's very hard, number one. Number two, we can always see good in some people. Take the priest in one hand and the farmer in the other. Why would one risk his life and help a couple of Jews, and the other one supposed to be compassionate and helping people turn us in? Well, my father and I always used to ask this question, what makes people do what they do? And then we realized the farmer did it because he had it in his heart, and the priest did it because for monetary value. What can he get out of it? And that was a big difference.
Nat, now that you've gone back to the farm, you're not going to be able to return to it because of what you described. How did your parents then make a living? They had a family to feed themselves, to support. How did they do that?
I remember when my father used to help the other farmers in the area in Bucim when there was a drought. He always helped them with money for seed for the next crop and so on. And they always told them, look, we don't know when we can pay you back. And my father always said, pay me back when you have it. So after the war, when we saw the farmer, when we thanked them, later on, told my father, he says, if that will help you, I can give you 30 heads of cattle to start a new little dairy farm. And my father said, I don't know when I can pay you back. He said, pay me back when you have it.
Hmm.
So my faith is the same thing. So it pays to be nice to people and pays to help people. And as you see in here, I don't know if anybody noticed, my father just recently returned from the forced labor camp, very, very skinny. So that was the first how we saw him when he first came back.
Did he say much after he was back about what he went through?
Not to us, but we didn't want to ask because we saw on his face that pretty much painful. I know he probably spoke to my mother, what he went through, and not completely tell it exactly what happened because he went through a lot. Later on in life, we spoke about it when he got older. So we spoke from time to time, what he went through, and he went through a lot.
As you mentioned a little while ago, of course, once the Russians were in control, anti-Semitism continued. So under these conditions, your parents decided to leave Romania, but it took them a good while. Why did it take, I think, 5 years for you to get out of Romania?
First, I'm trying to tell you what happened, but the rest of the family of both my mothers and fathers remained in Hungary. Can I talk to that a little bit about that?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please.
So we know from history that the Nazis invaded Hungary in March of 1944, and they immediately started to deport people. Between April and July of 1944, they deported 440,000 Jews, primarily to Auschwitz. Among these 440,000 Jews were 33 members of my extended family, my grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins. The young ones and the old ones were immediately put to death in the gas chambers because they were no use to the Germans for labor. Those young ones who were able to work were sent from Auschwitz to different camps. The only three people to know the fate of was my grandfather and two of my uncles. They stayed in one of the two camps of Auschwitz. My grandfather died of starvation 1 month before he was liberated. Both my uncles were liberated. One was 21 years old and 22 years old. Each one weighed 65 pounds, which is 30 kilograms. You can imagine what they looked like walking skeletons.
Right.
When the Red Cross came into these camps and they saw these people, the way they looked like, they put them on ships and sent them to Sweden, which was a neutral country during the war, to hospitals, to sanatoriums. Unfortunately, one of these two uncles did not make it to Sweden. He died on the ship and he was buried at sea. And one did survive and did get to Sweden. He stayed in Sweden for 4 years to gain his weight and his health back. So from 33 members of my entire family, only one survived. That's my uncle, Uncle Laser. So he was the only survivor out of the people who lived in Hungary at the time.
And I think this photograph is was this from after those 4 years?
That was in Sweden, right? And he actually sent a postcard. He sent it to us later on, and that's how it was his picture and that kind of postcard back he wrote in the back of the postcard.
Earlier in the program, Nat, we saw a photograph of you with your Aunt Hannah. Will you tell us what happened to Aunt Hannah?
Aunt Hannah was deported the same way like Uncle Laser did, probably towards the end of April, maybe the beginning of May. We don't know exactly. So she was in one of the cattle carts before my Uncle Laser was. So when she came off the cart, she was sent to the right in the selection process. She was sent to the right to be able to be sent to a forced labor camp. And the other people who were not able to work outside the cattle cars, they were helped to, they were immediately put to death as well. So she loved children like my mother did. And when she was walking on that line to the right, she saw a little child on the ground crying his head off. She felt bad for that child. She picked him up and she cuddled him. And then she went back to the line to go to the right. The Nazi who was directing that traffic says, "You're not going back there, you're going to the left." So about an hour and a half later, she and that little boy were put to the gas chamber and were dead.
And that was the result of her trying to comfort this crying child.
Correct. And we didn't know anything about it until Uncle Laser told us, because he was pretty much behind her and he saw everything that went on. And obviously he couldn't do anything to help.
Now, we have a question submitted from Instagram, and it is, what are some ways in your everyday life that you honor your relatives and their memories?
Number one, most of our children are named after those who were murdered by the Nazis. So that's one way we honor them. And we always remember, once a year in particular, we keep their memory alive. And that's how we remember them. You asked me a question earlier about, what took you so long. Mm-hmm. Can you ask the question again?
Yes. Your family you wanted to leave Romania, but it took a good while before you did.
So after we stayed in Romania for another 2 years, and then in 1947, my father realized there's no longer a future for Jewish people in Romania anymore. So we decided to leave. We found out that Palestine is open for refugees, or Jewish refugees from the Eastern Bloc countries. So we filed a visa request to leave Romania for Palestine. A few months later, we received a reply with a big stamp on that form, denied. So we were denied the exit. We kept filing the same thing, the same request over and over. And then finally, my mother was able to bribe the chief of police, and we were able to get the exit visa from Romania. And we went not to Palestine because it was not Palestine anymore, it was Israel. And we arrived in Israel in April of 1950. And after serving 3 years in the Israeli army, finally came to the United States to visit my uncle, Laser, who actually sponsored me to come here.
Laser, the same that we just saw you a few moments ago. I wish we had time for you to tell us about your life after the war, once you'd moved to Israel. We don't, unfortunately, but I do want to ask you this. You really took your father's advice, never give up, to heart. Tell us how that has served you throughout your life.
In life, we all have good times and bad times. We experience bad situations and do the best we can get. One situation came that I ran 12 marathons between age 65 and 81. After that, I realized I need some challenging. So I decided that I want to climb a mountain. The only thing is I needed to figure out which mountain I want to climb. So I finally settled on Mount Kilimanjaro. And we were climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. The first 6 days, everything was okay. The 7th day, we started the climb at 11 p.m. to reach the summit at sunrise the next day. So about 6 hours later, I pretty much was completely exhausted. It was dark, windy, freezing cold, snow blowing every directions. I was completely depleted of all energy, didn't have any energy, even an ounce. So I pretty much decided I'm done. I'm never going to reach the mountain top. But then all of a sudden I heard my father said, "Nat, never give up." And at that moment, I got all that energy and I knew I'm going to make that summit. And 2 hours later, I was standing on the tallest single unit mountain in the world, watching the sun come up, most beautiful sun that I've ever seen in my life.
This is
2000. And also, by the way, at a height of 19,341 feet above the clouds.
Almost 20,000 feet, age 83 in 2019. Thanks, Nat. I have just one more question for you today. As we face rising anti-Semitism, related conspiracy theories, and Holocaust denial, please tell us what we can learn from what you experienced during the Holocaust.
Many powerful people and many powerful nations kept silent about the atrocities and the genocide committed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Now we saw what happened and we saw what the outcome was. We cannot remain silent anymore. We must speak out. Not only must we speak out, we must take sides. We can't take sides with the bad people or with the good people. Always take sides with the good people. And what happened, by the way, you cannot stay neutral either. You got to take a point, you got to take sides. So what we do, because remaining neutral, it actually benefits the perpetrator, not the victims. So keep speaking out, and when you see something, hate or anti-Semitism, speak out and make that voice heard.
Nat, thank you so much for being with us today, for being our first person. I think you have successfully spent your lifetime climbing mountains, both figuratively and literally, and running marathons to boot, never giving up. Thank you, Nat, so much for today.
Thank you very much for listening.
I'd like to take a moment to thank our donor. First Person is made possible through the generous support of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to invite you to join us again on Wednesday, September 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Holocaust survivor and museum volunteer Josiane Traum. Josie was just 3 years old when she was separated from her mother and placed into hiding in Belgium with the help of the resistance. Tune in to hear her reflect on her survival at such a young age. Thank you all for watching today's First Person program with Nat Shaffir.